Thank you very much for attending, everybody. There's going to be a lot of slides in this, so I'll warn you now. Don't go to sleep or you'll miss something. Basically, I'll be talking about the archaeological recovery of human remains from the Battle of Towton in 1461. So let's get going. There's a lot to see. Just as a background, the location of Towton is about 10 miles southwest of the town of York, right slap bang in the centre of Britain, as you can see there. The battle was part of one of the battles from the Wars of the Roses, and it was fought between the present King Henry VI and the up-and-coming, who later became Edward IV, King Edward IV, but at this time he was either Earl of March or Duke of York. Here we have an aerial view of the battlefield itself. The white line represents the Yorkists, and the red line with the Lancashirians, who eventually lost and subsequently routed back north towards Tadcaster, where they came from. And it was in 1996 that we were brought to Towton Hall, and that's where the spot is there, because of human remains discovered by builders during the excavation of foundation trenches for the extension to Towton Hall. So there's Towton Hall in the as it was as we saw it in 1996, and you can see here this is the garage that was demolished, taken down, and it was during this demolition and the subsequent renovation of that side of the hall where they discovered human remains. So here is the garage and the extension demolished. And in July 1996, they were digging the foundation trenches for the new walls when the builders found half or a part of the mass graves from a battle, battle victims. Then in September 1996, we were brought in and we subsequently excavated the second half of the grave, and that's what I'll be discussing today, amongst other things. So there's a plan of Towton Hall as we found it in 1996. The thick red line is the new extension, and it was during the excavation of those excavation trenches that they found the mass grave. And then we came in 1996 and we excavated the second half. And that's what it looked like when most of the human remains were fully exposed. And if we look at a sideways view of the mass grave, you can see that it's extensive with, there was a minimum number of 38 individuals in this part of the excavation. We don't know the exact number of human remains discovered by the builders because all that went unrecorded. So unfortunately, nobody knows anything about those human remains at all. The human remains are quite famous now. So if you see all the TV programs we've done and the books that we've written, we can show all the trauma that the skeletons had undergone, including the slices across the faces and the polearm weapons into the side of the head and all sorts of horrible trauma. Basically, there was a distribution on all the remains of the puncture wounds, which were the sharp point trauma that had left marks on the skeletal material. Then there's the sharp edge trauma, so that's any bladed edge that had cut into the skull. And then there's a blunt force trauma, so something like a mace that would just have thumped into the skull and left a depression or a mark, but not perforated or scratched the skull, as in the other types of trauma. And then in 2000, and then in 2007, we produced first the hardback book and then the softback, Blood Red Roses, the Archaeology of Mass Graves from the Battle of Towton, which has been quite successful, I'm glad to say, because I'm still getting royalties from it. So what I want to do now also is look at further excavations on the Towton battlefield. So what I'll do is I'll try to keep you in some sort of perspective so you can see where you are in terms of where we were in 1996. So that's where the mass grave was in 1996. And then in 1998, we were given the chance to, Mrs. Verity, the landowner, was going to cut this path across the centre of the lawn. So she said, I presume you want to excavate my lawn? And I said, yes, of course. because we were always looking for something around there to excavate. And during that excavation, we found lots of building rubble that was part of the renovations of the hall. And these building rubbles generally dated to the late 18th century. And during those, we did find some, human remains, one human tooth in those in that building rubble. So we know that somebody had also uncovered some human remains somewhere else during work around the house. But that's all we found there. No more graves. And then in 2002, we decided that the best place to look for other human remains was next to the other human remains we'd already found. So we were given a chance to excavate under the dining room window there. And we went down, you can see the slide on the left. We came down against the wall and we found one human bone, which was the thigh bone. So, of course, we excavated further, and there we found this individual who was buried half under the wall. Obviously, he wasn't buried under the wall was built on top of him afterwards. So it definitely predated the construction of Towton Hall. And we've got an excavation drawing there. So you can see the individual who's half under the wall. It was a single burial, and again, no other burials around him. And this one we left in situ. We analysed the remains, and then we reburied it because there wasn't enough really to get any more information from him. So we thought it's safer to leave him until eventually somebody might take the hall down another few hundred years or something, and then they'll find him again. But this individual had a very severe case of rickets. But apart from that, there was no obvious evidence of trauma. Mind you, it's only the lower part of the body. And most of the other remains from Towton have got trauma to the top of their body. So we don't know if this individual died at the Battle of Towton, but there's good evidence to suggest now that he had done. I'll show you why. So in 2002, so a couple of years later, we got a chance to excavate in the cellar of Towton Hall. There's very few places we've not been in Towton Hall now, so I'll warn you now. So Mrs. Verity allowed us into the cellar, and here's an old plan of the hall. So again, there's where the mass grave was in 1996, bottom right, and the cellar is on the left there. And there's a rough sketch I did of the cellar as we found it. And as you'll notice in this bottom right-hand corner, there's something going on. So there's a photograph of the bottom right-hand corner of Towton Hall and the cellar. And you can see there's a distinct line in the stonework. And if I highlight it there, you definitely see a difference in the wall. So it looked like it was a blocked doorway or something like an excavation that had been undertaken. So what we did is we took out the top stones from that blocked doorway and to see what was behind them. Because, did I mention that? Hang on a minute. Yeah. The story, I forgot that bit. The story was that in the cellars of Towton Hall were extended to meet a solid wall of human skeletons in the late 1700s. Now, remember, we've already found a human tooth in excavating rubble from the late 1700s. So this seemed to tie into this story. So we thought, right, if we get a chance to excavate in the cellar, we'll see if there are any more remains. Is this story true, basically? So I'll flick forwards to this. Took that top stone out, and behind there was lots of rubble built up. And inside that rubble, there was more human remains, but it was in excavated construction material again. So they were disarticulated. And this time there was some finger bones and a couple of teeth. So not in situ, and we don't know where they're from, but they're in building rubble from the late 1700s. So somebody's finding something and they're distributing all these human remains around. Not only that, but when we excavated all the rubble from inside behind this wall, and that's as big as the hole was, so it was literally that big. So every day we were crawling in and out of excavations that were that big, the size of that hole. So that was fun. So we eventually cleared the whole of that void behind the wall, and we found a block staircase. So that's what the blocked wall was. So the story of the human remains looked valid, but when we investigated, we found it was a blocked staircase. So we did find human remains, but they weren't from there either. So we're still no wiser as to where all these human remains are coming from. So not giving up, we decided if we'd found human remains in 96 and in 2002, we thought if we excavated the space, a very small piece of ground in between that we'd left, because there was a concrete foundation for the garage that taken down in 1996, and it was about that wide. So what we did is we decided to take up the garage foundation in a very small hole. So there's the test pit with the garage foundation, solid concrete about that thick. And we didn't have jackhammers, so like a fool that I was, I decided to attack it with this big crowbar. And it took all day to get through it, but eventually we got through it, we removed it. We extended the trench as well, moved along, took some more of the concrete foundations up, and we came across this, which were human remains from the side of the mass graves that we couldn't excavate in 1996. So these are the remaining parts of the body that we were unable to recover in 1996. And this individual has been analysed. It's more extensive than this, but obviously cleaning it up, and it all was falling into the mass grave hole. But basically, it was the remains of a young middle adult who was about 25 to 29 years old. What we didn't expect was this chap who lay next to the mass grave, but was not in the mass grave. And as you can see, he is securely buried under Towton Hall, again, like his friend next, a couple of meters away. But this one was slightly more exposed. So we had more to go on this individual. So we excavated him fully, and he was a 46-year-old plus old middle adult, and he was relatively tall at 179 centimeters. Now, what was important here is, unlike the individual next to him, who was half buried underneath the wall, is that the rest of his body was under the corner of this wall, or at least we thought it was. And we thought it's more than likely when they built the hall, and it turns out to be built roughly in the late 1500s, early 1600s, they obviously found this skeleton because the stones are lying on top of the skeleton. But these aren't the hand bones, but are they the teeth bones? So we don't know. But they're not from the 18th century. This house was built in the 16th or 17th century. So it doesn't fit in with the building remains. So we wanted to find any evidence of this person to see if he's got trauma on him. So luckily for us, there was a hole in the foundation of the hall. So rather carefully, we excavated between the stones, and there was a hole about that big. So we very carefully excavated it. And at the bottom of that excavation, the skull had gone, and all the top of the skeleton had gone. And we couldn't find anything apart from the occipital bone, that's that bit there, of that chap's skeleton. And on the occipital bone, there was evidence of weapon trauma. So this individual definitely died in the Battle of Towton in 1461. So unlike his friend next to him, we couldn't tell, this individual definitely was. So we've got a mass grave, then we've got an individual grave, but everybody there died in the battle. The chap next to them, we don't know, but we're not finished yet, so we'll see. So there we are. Then we've got the mass grave, we've got the additional remains we found next to them. Then we got the 2003 excavation, that one we've just seen. And then we've got 2002 excavation of the individual we left in situ. So the archaeologists amongst you would probably just ask the question you're just dying to know, and that is, what is there? And that is the dining room of Towton Hall. So it's not every day you can go to somebody and say, excuse me, can we dig up the floor of your dining room? Because this is a big house and they're quite posh. But we did ask them and they said yes. So here we go. So we went to the Royal Armouries and said, excuse me, can you give us loads of money because we've got this great excavation? And they said yes as well. So we were away. So here we are. We're in the front of Towton Hall again. That's the dining room we're now going to go into. And the excavation was funded by the Royal Armouries. We're very grateful, and especially with certain key people in the Royal Armouries who helped extensively. And this is now 2005. So, first of all, we have the floorboards. Take up the carpet. You've got floorboards. Take up the floorboards. You've got lots of floor joists. Now, unfortunately, we could take up the carpet, the floorboards, but we couldn't take up the floor joists because they went underneath all the walls. And I wasn't about to start undermining the whole of Towton Hall to that extent. So basically what we did was we took off the topsoil and left the floor joists in situ, which was a complete nightmare because we had to excavate on the top of pieces of wood that were that wide. So you imagine, you think excavation is bad enough, but when you've got to kneel on a piece of wood and then go between almost upside down. So just for today, I've got rid of the floor joists so we can actually see what it looked like without the joists. And hopefully you can see that that floor, this is with the topsoil removed, or the equivalent to the topsoil. Those stones are not an even distribution across the whole of that floor, are they? There's definitely a distinct pattern or more of a rough area in the bottom right-hand corner. And I can tell you what shape it should be. It's about that shape. And I'm not just making this up because those look distinctly like graves. And that's what we're looking for. So we've taken up Mrs. Verity's dining room floor, and now we've decided that there may possibly be human remains underneath her dining room. And she was really excited about this, luckily. So anyway, so what do? We clean that up. We've seen these anomalies in the corner. Are they graves? And the answer is yes. And there's 4 of them, rather 2 graves and 4 individuals. There was 1 individual in the one mass grave, one grave there, and there were 3 in a single grave next to him. So what I've done is I've spun these around and made them bigger so that we can all see them more clearly. So first of all, we'll deal with this individual here, which is skeleton 110. And he was buried alone. And as you can see by his skull, he's got weapon trauma, blunt force trauma and sharp force trauma on top of the skull. So he definitely died in the Battle of Towton. But what's interesting is you can see from the plan here, this chap, for some unknown reason, has got stones lodged on his shoulders. Now, remember, he's lying flat, so they're not just precariously perched there, but they were definitely placed vertical stones on his shoulders, like one there and one there, which was rather perplexing. And we didn't know what it was, but I think, hopefully we can discuss this afterwards. So remind me to talk about that. And there he is, excavated. There's our floor joists. They're always in the way, and I can't do anything about that. And there are the stones next to his skull. And as you can see by this illustration, that's how close the top of the skull was to the underlying beams and also the topsoil. So basically, somebody had been walking on him and his head while they were building Towton Hall, and yet he was all still there. So if they knew he was there, they were very careful. I don't think they knew he was there. I think they were just walking around, and we're just very lucky that he survived. And you see the stones there in situ, 2 flat stones sitting vertical on his shoulders. Very odd. Right, so we move to the next individual, which was skeleton 111, who was a 36 to 45-year-old old middle adult, 184. So these people are average and slightly above average medieval height. And there he is in situ, under his joists. And this one is very strange because, like the skeleton of Richard III, when found in 2012, was it? He had the same nick on his chin. And that's the only trauma he had on his skull. But what is significant, if you look at the drawing there, is that right down the back of his skull, from the foramen magnum, which is the hole where the spine goes in and all the nerves, halfway up the back of his skull, it was completely cracked open. And that was perimortem, because this individual, as you can see by all the nasal bones and all the teeth, he was in perfect condition. Something has damaged his skull to the point where it smashed his skull open and not left a mark on it, which suggests to me that he was wearing a helmet. In which case, like Richard III, is this nick on the chin an attempt to take a helmet off? Because what you do is you go in with a knife, you go, cut the strap, I'm having that, thank you very much, and run away with a helmet. And there's a number of Towton individuals and other medieval trauma individuals from battles that have got this nick on the chin. And now I'm wondering whether this individual had a helmet on, because the rest of his skull is completely intact, and yet he obviously suffered extensive trauma to the head that didn't mark his skull at all. But we don't know. It's just an interpretation. Then skeleton 112, who's a young middle adult, and again 180 height. There he is with his pals. And this individual had a very distinct trauma. This one's not actually, until last week or week before, he was on display in the Richard III exhibition in York. So I don't know where he is now. He might still be there. But if you look at this, the drawing, rather than the skeletal photograph there, this individual had been stabbed through the face. Very sharp, very distinctive, and very limited. So it wasn't a slash to the face, this was a stab. And again, not much more head trauma, but if you put a knife in there, or a sword, it's only going to go one way, and that's through there and right into all your gullet. So it's going to hurt. But what was interesting in this individual, as you can see by the drawing, he still had all his teeth in that location. And the roots of those teeth were actually cut off. So this chap had been buried with all his flesh still intact, and the teeth were still glued to his jaw, and yet they were all loose when we found them. So he died through this stab wound to the face, and all his teeth had managed to stay in place until we found them, and then they all just fell away. That's an amazing preservation in situ of the actual skeletal remains. Then we've got skeleton 113, who's a 26 to 35-year-old young middle adult, 173 in height. Now, as you can see, he's been really squished into the corner of this grave. So there he is. And we did check further on. So he is the end individual in there. It came up the grave cut on the other side. So there were only 4 individuals we did check. And this individual had extensive skull trauma. As you can see by the drawing, the right side of his head had at least 2 sword cuts, very long slashing cuts. So somebody gone like this into the side of his head twice, and then there was a stab wound behind it. Usually what we find when there's these, it's somebody's probably brought him down with a sword blow. So they've probably gone whack, fall over, stab. So quite often you've got a knife in one hand and a sword in the other. So you're probably doing this, fending yourself off from sword blows. Something, you make contact with a skull, go down, stab, and off you go to somebody else. So it's interesting that we've got both on this skull. Something else that I'll bring to mind while I'm here, and that is this. If you look at the location of these collection of stones in relation to that top grave, and it's exactly where you would put a grave marker. And right next to the grave marker, there is small find number 4. And small find number 4 was, here it is, photograph of it, and a zoom in, and it was a bead, medieval bead. No idea why it was there. But sometime later, I came across an absolutely unbelievable photograph. During the Falklands War, the Argentinians were allowed to go and visit their Catholic comrades who had died. And they were laying rosary beads on the grave marker of their companions. So is this a rosary bead that was wrapped around a grave marker and it's fallen off? No idea, but it's a great interpretation. So there we are. There we have, at the moment, there is another place I'd like to dig in Towton Hall, and I'm not going to say where it is because Mrs. Verity will kill me. But basically, these are the human remains as we now know them. rather extensively spread across that corner of Towton Hall. So we've got the mass grave and all the individual graves. In terms of we know that the two who are buried under the house obviously predate the house. But what about the other excavations, these other graves? Because obviously they are not under a wall. So are they dated to the same time? Well, what we did is we simply looked at the excavation trench, and you can see that the excavation trench of that wall cuts through the grave. So that they are dated to, obviously, we could radiokarma date them, but this is a lot easier way of doing it. And that is the same date as the other chaps as well. They've got the weapon trauma and the underlie. They do underlie stratigraphically the wall of Towton Hall. So as I said, this is the interpretation of the bead, and this is a photograph I found in the Guardian. And he's placing rosary beads over his fellow soldiers' graves. So it's just one of the interpretations, but it's a nice one because it would show that somebody's caring for them and coming back to care for them afterwards. So now we've got loads of time. But so now if we look at human remains in other parts of the battlefield, so now we were at Towton Hall. Towton Hall is about half a mile, 3/4 mile from the centre of the medieval battlefield as we know it. So why are the burials at Towton Hall? Well, we know now that there was a medieval chapel there at the time. So that was consecrated ground. Now we know that's a long story, but anyway, that's another presentation in itself. So now we're moving away from the battlefield and away from Towton Hall, back into the centre of the battlefield. And we know it's the centre of the battlefield because one of my colleagues, Simon Richardson, has been extensively metal detecting this region for about since the early 80s. And these are 15th century medieval artifacts that almost certainly are battle related. And you see the distribution, they fall nicely into the location of where we know the battle was fought. But luckily for us, in the centre of the battlefield, in 2005, we did an excavation and found some more human remains. And we did this because we were carrying out this geophysical survey in the corner of the field. And this is a magnetometer survey. And while we were carrying out the magnetometer survey, I found 2 human teeth. I'm doing well at finding human teeth, actually. I just wish I could find more of them. 2 human teeth in that location. So of course, we're in the middle of a field, or rather in the corner of a field. So why not excavate a trench exactly where you found these teeth to see where the teeth are coming from? So we did. So we did a trial excavation of a 1 meter by 4 meter test trench. And as soon as we started to go down into the topsoil, we started to find medieval arrowheads and human teeth and human finger bones and small bones. And the deeper we got down, the more bones we found. But they were all disarticulated. So as we got to the bottom of the grave, were we expecting a mass grave like at Towton Hall, or were we expecting something different? And the answer was, they were all disarticulated. And these are the largest bones we found, which is the radius and the ulna from the forearm, but sort of semi-articulated in that it was still joined at the wrist, but they've been splayed open. So obviously they'd been moved from their original location where they'd been buried. Not just that, we found, those are the largest human remains we found. The smallest human remains we found during the excavation was the front of a tooth. So we sieved everything and found every single bone that we could do from that excavation trench. And there were a few of them, because there they are in plan at the top and then in section all the way down. And we got so many that we couldn't actually record the detail, because we weren't set up for this test trench, the detail of the number of human remains we were finding in that trench, because there was over 300 of them. And those are just little collections we found in concentrated areas. And there's the excavation trench, not quite completed, but that's how far we got. We excavated a little bit in the middle of it, and it was just packed full of human remains. So we cleaned it up, recorded it, and stopped. So we didn't even get to the bottom of that trench or that feature, because that was the side of a mass grave from the Battle of Towton. And these individuals had weapon trauma on some of them. So they were individuals that were killed in the Battle of Towton, but they were not in situ. So like some of our bones that we found at Towton Hall, these had been buried and then moved somewhere else. Well, these had only been jumbled around and moved because this mass grave was excavated in 1484 on the orders of Richard III. He gave a grant for the local lord to come back on the battlefield and excavate all the pits, take the human remains out and put them in Saxon churchyard where they reside to this day. Except they weren't very good at it because they took most of the big bones, the skulls, the long bones, anything they could find, potentially any bone, but they left considerable numbers behind. And this is from just a small test pit in the center of that trench. There was over 300. So we estimate there are thousands, tens of thousands of human remains disarticulated just in this one pit. And history tells us there are at least 3 or 5 pits. We don't know if they've all been excavated or only one's been excavated and exhumed. So that's something to do for the future. All of these individuals have been analysed by osteologists, including Marlene Holst, who's from York Osteoarchaeology. The minimum number from that pit, from that hole, was 9. Now, that is considerably less than the 28,000 people who were apparently killed during the Battle of Towton. So they have been disarticulated. So you could say that most of them have been removed, but that's just from a very small hole. So how many people were actually killed, buried, and then unburied and exhumed and reburied in Towton's Saxon churchyard? And we don't know. So this is something for future archaeologists to get their head around because all the evidence is still there. And there's an ethical question, one we could raise. Is this still a grave? Because the church thinks it's been exhumed. Richard III and the government think it's been exhumed. So there, is it officially a grave? Because they seem to think that they've done and dusted, wiped their hands and everything's been cleaned up. But as we can show archaeologically, it's anything but cleaned up. So, is it the excavation of a grave, a mass grave, an exhumed grave? We don't know. It's an ongoing problem because if you don't want to ethically excavate a mass grave, is this still a mass grave? So I don't know. I'll let everybody ponder that. Mm-hmm. So that's the excavation from that. That report is now available online. From the Towton battlefield and all the human remains from the hall. And then a few years ago, Marlon and I, because of all these human remains and the others we'd found in around Towton, we rewrote, Marlon re-examined all the human remains and then added the extra ones to them and redid the statistical analysis. And then we published it in a German conference we went to in 2013-14, which was Battlefield and Mass Graves in Germany. So this is now available online. So if you want to get your head around all the numbers and the boring, huge amounts of statistics to do with human remains, most people don't, but some of you will here, I'm sure, then you've got it available online. Most of it's through my academia page if you want to, or there are other ways of getting hold of it. But those are human remains are published. So I think that's, I've done quite well there, done a bit of a rush. So basically all I want to say now is we can definitely show that the recovering human remains from a historic battlefield allows a more accurate assessment of the individuals who fought and died there. And until I started doing battlefield research in post-1996, when we found the mass grave, nobody was doing this in Britain. So all this is from very small, limited number of excavations on a battlefield, on a known battlefield. And that's what we've come up with. So imagine if they did this on every single historic battlefield in the country and in the world. Now, in America, this is quite extensive. And they do this quite regularly, but we're only talking about a couple of 100 years, obviously. But we've got an extensive amount of, Europe has an extensive amount of mass graves going back from into the Mesolithic and the Neolithic. So we've got hundreds of thousands of graves to deal with. But this is a potential that I want to highlight. It's absolutely unbelievable, and it's an untapped resource. And until literally a couple of decades ago, 25 years ago now, actually, horribly enough. And this is what we need to consider, is what we're missing out on, because until we started doing this, all these historic battlefields were just the domain of historians. And quite a lot of what we found looking at the archaeological remains, we found that a lot of the history is purely and simply wrong. So that's something to leave you with. So hopefully that's it. So thank you very much. I'm on time. Ish.
Excellent. That's fascinating. We'll have questions, but I'd like to perhaps nip in first. Two things.
You'll have to do that.
I'm on my feet, nobody else is. Two things. Firstly, you mentioned Saxton Churchyard.
Yes.
There is one burial in Saxton Churchyard which fascinates me, and that is Lord Dacre. Who was he killed at the battle?
Yes.
Now, the rumour is that he's buried on his horse in Saxton Churchyard. I've been and I've had a look, and I can't see anything, of course, because there's not been any.
Do you like this rumour, or do you want me to demolish it?
I'd like you to tell me the truth.
The evidence is that in the, I think it was the late 18th century, they were digging a grave next to Lord Dacre, and they found a horse's skull. And that's where the legend comes from. And since then, they've gone from a horse's skull to having a whole horse there, to having Lord Dacre sitting on his horse, etc., etc. Now, the good news is that I don't think he's even buried there. And the reason for this is, and I could go on to it in depth and bore you really to death, but there is very good reason, and that is because of those mass graves we found in the centre of the battlefield. I believe that Lord Dacre was there. He was killed there and buried in those graves. Subsequently, those graves were exhumed and they were buried in Saxon graveyard. We know where that exhumed material is. And one end is in the middle of the north end of the graveyard, and the other is a big trench, and the other end is under Lord Dacre's tomb. Lord Dacre's tomb, I'm pretty convinced, is a memorial. And I think he was put there because they knew who was in the pit. They'd exhumed the pit. So his body was somewhere in that mass grave of exhumed material. So somebody went and memorialized Lord Dacre, but they didn't know where he was exactly. But they knew where he was approximately, and that was somewhere in this hole. And then if you look at the archaeological evidence for this, and that is, it's a very nice tomb, and it's made of a certain type of very nice stone. So you've got to start disassembling the whole thing. And that is, why is a leading member of the aristocracy buried in a little village church in the middle of nowhere?
He liked the beer at the pub.
Obviously. Why is he a leading member of the aristocracy outside a little village when every other Tom, Dick and Harry of any status is inside, usually next to the altar? So that doesn't make sense either. And when you disassemble it, none of it makes sense apart from the fact that he's in that mass grave and it's a memorial. And that's as close as they could get to marking Lord Dacre's grave. It's not as romantic as the real version, as the other version, but I think that's more than likely what the evidence points towards. In which case, that tomb probably dates from 1484 or later, when the mass grave was exhumed and put back into Saxton Churchyard. So the writing on the top says, "Here lies Lord Dacre." Well, that's not a lie, because he's probably in that pit. As for his horse, that still apparently exists in the British Museum, that skull. So I'd love to find it, because it could be Celtic, it could be Celtic, it could be Saxon, it could be could be prehistoric. It's just a horse skull that was next to Lord Dacre's tomb.
Without any harnessing on it.
Without anything on it. So the story is that they found the horse skull and the neck vertebrae going underneath Lord Dacre's tomb. But of course, the other thing is, if you imagine that there are no neck vertebrae attached to this horse's skull, if you're told to exhume the mass grave in 1484 and you're getting paid for it, are you going to differentiate between the human remains and the horse remains? Somebody's just going, see that hole, empty it, take all the bones you find and put them in that big hole in Saxton churchyard. So that's another interpretation, is that there may be all sorts of bones in this mass grave of all the soldiers. Now, we take it for granted you can tell the difference between a horse's skull and a human skull. So surely they're not going to start burying horses' skulls in with human remains. But if they're burying remains and they're doing it on quantity on the back of a wagon, put a few skulls in there from horses and anything else, as long as it's a bone, that's what we were told to do, stick it in that hole, and nobody's any the wiser. So that's another interpretation.
You can see how fascinating it is. You can sit all your evenings, and one evening you can make one conclusion and another evening make another conclusion. It's almost like the House of Commons, isn't it?
Keith, we've got a few questions that can actually lead on from that. Am I okay to?
Can I just nip in one extra?
Oh, Keith.
No, all right, I'll do it on
I'll
time.
allow you. Go on. Nip in your.
Is there any evidence that there were medical people on the battlefield, battlefield surgeons?
We don't know if they're on the battlefield, but one individual from the mass grave, number 16, he's the famous one who they did a reconstruction on the TV program. And he had unbelievable heel trauma. Basically, his jaw was fractured there. He got a sword blow in the side of his face, he'd taken all the roots of his teeth off like the other individual had gone in there. So he cracked his jaw. There was a slice there from a sword blow, and that had broken all his teeth out. So this man had his jaw hanging off, basically. So somebody had re-strapped it up, and then he'd survived, and all this had healed. Well, I'd like somebody to do that to me if I was caught in a traffic accident and there was no medical attention around, because this chap survived. So you've got to argue that they knew what they were doing.
Yes.
Very well. Now, whether that was on the battlefield, somebody obviously took him off the battlefield and started to look after him straight away, because he would have had a severe infection, presumably, from a wound like that. So their medical knowledge was very good, and it's a lot better than we give them credit for, because there is a lot of evidence on the Towton skeletons for significant head wounds that were healed.
Yes.
You know, somebody got a blow on the head, going 1/4 of an inch inside your skull, and it survived because it was all healed over again. So they knew how to look after people. It's fantastic, really.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you. So the one that led on from you talking about mass graves before reads, are the remains buried in or near the medieval church at Towton Hall likely to be from more important members of the troops, and the mass graves likely to be the ordinary soldiers?
The simple answer to that is probably yes, because there is evidence, and again, there's huge amounts of potential research into this, but there is evidence to suggest that the three that were in the triple grave under the dining room and the one that was next to the triple grave, they had very similar non-metric traits, which suggests tentatively they might have been related. Now, if they were related, they were either very lucky, but they were separated from the mass grave. They weren't put in a mass grave, but they were put in a little mass grave, you know, a triple grave, and they were treated with respect. And you could even argue that the one that was next to that might even have had a headstone. So did they all have headstones? Did the mass grave have a headstone? The individuals in the mass grave were treated with some sort of respect, but they were east-west, west-east, and then at the end, they were almost certainly put in there in a manner that utilised the space. So initially they were buried like that, stacked up as they went along the grave. Then as they got to the edge of the grave, somebody thought, oh, we'll just stick one in here. So the last one went in right across the grave. So rather than being, imagine those are individuals, one went instead of that way, one went there. And that's where the hole was at the end of the grave. So somebody went, well, we'll put one in there. And then the very last one, they thought, right, we've got one more. Oh, we'll stick him on top of that one. So they went backwards, went to the middle of the grave and put him in the middle because there was going to be a mound of soil over it. So the top one was presumably right close to the surface again. So they were utilizing the space. They started off treating them with some respect, and then it all went to pieces at the end. You could argue that those are more respected Yorkist soldiers, or they could be the Lancashrians that just thought, put them in a mass grave. We don't know, unless we get some way of finding that out.
When you were talking about respect, there's a question that's come in saying medieval ossuaries, is that the right pronunciation? Sorry.
Ossuaries.
Only required the skull and two femurs to be together to allow the individual to ascend to heaven. Would the reburials at Saxton just be the minimum from each individual to allow entry to heaven, and thus leave all the other bits in situ in the battlefield?
It's a very good point. Yes. The simple answer is we don't know enough about all this, but yes, there are things that we could suggest is more likely than unlikely. The soils at Towton lend themselves to be slightly more carefully exhumed than the evidence shows. So it looks like they were definitely going for the big ones, and they probably just picked out anything else. But there were, for example, there was a section of spine still in situ with 4 vertebrae in. There was a complete hand that was on the side of the grave, virtually complete. There was a complete foot. So when they were disarticulated, when they were disinterred in 1484, these were semi-articulated human remains. They were still gooey. They still had the tendons and the bits and pieces holding their remains together. So what it was like excavating a mass grave from 20 years before, I don't know, but it wouldn't have been very pleasant because they were not totally skeletonized. So imagine that. That's not nice, is it?
Do you know, Tim, why just one of the skulls of the 4 skeletons were on display at the Richard III exhibition? Do you know if it was chosen because of the specific weapon trauma or anything else?
Not really. To be honest, most of the human remains from Towton, as you've seen by some of the slides, they're very fragmented. And if you're going to start showing human remains, you've got to treat them with respect, but also people want to see and identify it as a skeleton. And that's one of the few that actually still look like a skeleton, not a fragment of collection of human bones. So that's more the reason why we showed it. So it's easier for them to display it, and obviously people can see what it is, rather than just having a collection of bones laid out for a display.
And the last question, sorry, from Zoom before we move to here, that many people want to know. Tell us about the shoulder stones.
Well, if you look at, now I've been pondering this for years, and again, it's just an open interpretation, I don't know. But if you look at medieval monks at the time, they quite often are buried, and slightly earlier, they're buried in coffins that have got a stone surround around the head. Can you picture that in your mind? Have you seen them? So it's a coffin-shaped coffin, except for the head, which has got this very specific area carved into the stone. And that reminded me of this individual we found. And I thought, they're trying to mark him out as being something different. Is it possible that this is a rudimentary exhibition, that this man might have been even more special? He's been separated not from the mass grave, not only from the mass grave, but from his triple grave next to him. And he's aside from them as well. And this is the one that's potentially got a grave marker and potentially even a set of rosary beads that were hanging over it. I was thinking, is this man a priest? Is it as simple as that? Was he a priest? In which case, if they've got a special priest burial for him, obviously they've not got time to start carving out a big stone coffin. But it's this way of them marking him as a priest, and then they give him a headstone, like a lot of priests do. Let's face it, if you go into a lot of medieval churchyards, it's the priests that have got these big, glorified, elaborate stones in the medieval period. They spend more money on them. So is this a way of marking this individual out as somebody even more special than even the aristocracy, for example. I don't know. But it is quite a nice interpretation.
That was my question about the. I was just wondering whether it was anything to do with similar like the Vikings used to do to cause bodies in a burial. They used to drop stones and.
That's the other thing. Was it there to hold the skull up? So it was, nice and vertical. There are other ways of doing it. You could just put a bit of soil either side. So yes and no, I don't know. It does seem to be marking him out. It's like epaulets. We would see these as epaulets now, stone epaulets, which again denote rank. So is there something that we don't know? I've been trawling through medieval excavations and seeing if I can find anything similar, and I can't. So if you find anything, please let me know. I'd love to know other parallels to these for people who've got. You're going to tell me now, hopefully.
No, I find in a lot of the monastic cemeteries like Scotland that you have these pillow burials. Is there any possibility that the stones could have slipped somehow?
No, they were very specifically, yeah.
So they were,
He'd been buried, and they'd moved very slightly. They tilted a bit because obviously they're tall and thin. They've been standing on their end, so obviously they're going to move as the burial moves and this, that, and the other. But no, they were in situ, and they were definitely on his shoulders.
not necessarily to keep the head.
Well, it may be, but you'd think they were doing that then instead of this. It'd be sort of more like that. So again, the more you look at it, the more it looks specific, as if they were on his shoulders. It is.
I had a question about the individual with the nick on his mandible.
Yes.
I found a couple of those a few years ago in medieval Chester, but it was just the mandible, so it didn't have the vertebra. So at the time, I thought, could it have been a botched decapitation? That kind of nicks the posterior angle. I assume, and Marlon may be able to answer this, is that I assume there's nothing found on the vertebra to suggest.
There was no obvious evidence of decapitation or attempted decapitation. Basically, these people, imagine if everybody in this room suddenly were given knives and sword, and you said, right, fair enough, last one alive can go out the building. And everybody sets to it. Well, you don't start being very specific if you are endangered with your life to that extent. So we can't overinterpret these because these people were fighting for their life. So if I attacked Keith now I'd go boom, boom, stab, off he goes. Somebody else is going to come on me. I'm not going to bother playing around, do something extra to Keith. He's already down, he's gone. So if you start overinterpreting this, you're missing the point, and that is that this battle was like a horrendous atmosphere to be in. It must have been incredibly scary and very traumatic mentally as well as physically. There is a lot of evidence that a number of these individuals have got cracked teeth, and they seem to be perimortem-ish cracked teeth, and it looks like they were strained to the point where they're actually grinding the teeth, potentially breaking them, or they could have been belted with something that broke the teeth. But they were more of a stress fracture than actually a damage fracture. So I don't know, that's something else to consider, but the mental trauma of going into battle is something we shouldn't underestimate either, let alone the niceties of chivalric warfare and things like this. I think all that's out of the windows. These people are fighting for their lives, and also they were fighting to become incredibly wealthy. Because if you could find somebody on that battlefield who's a lord or whatever, and they'd be carrying purses of gold and this, that, and the other on them, or just basically anything of any value, and it was all pilfered. So medieval battlefields were known to be places where you could become exceedingly rich. It's like shooting somebody with a Ferrari, jumping in and driving off with it. So would you not bother? Maybe, I don't know.
Tim, the weapon trauma, was that only found on the schools, or were there other bones that had the trauma?
Yeah, I've got to be careful going into this bit, because there are numerous people that continually overemphasize the fact that it doesn't exist that these individuals are executed. They were not executed as in take the side, arms tied behind the back, and chopped off one at a time. There is not the slightest bit of evidence for that, and yet that is one of the new legends that is associating itself with this mass grave, and that is because of one individual that I recorded late one night and then early the next morning, and I think it's my fault. I'll put my hand up because I said, is it possible this chap has his hand tied behind his back? So if you read Blood Red Roses or you see the film or all the programs, what happened was that because this one individual was excavated one day, and the individual on top of him, sorry, underneath him, was excavated the next day, we left one arm behind, and it's just the wrong arm. So this individual had what looked like his arm tied behind his back like that, except this wasn't his arm, it was somebody else's. So that's how legends are formed. And the archaeological evidence is precise. There is no evidence for execution, as we would call it. And yet some people constantly regurgitate this error in the data. So
Have there been any DNA studies?
yes, but I can't keep track of them all. So there is a lot more potential research in this. So I would love to, for example, I'd love to see if those 4 individuals are related, because they've got, it's not just one non-metric trait that are in common, there's about 3 or 4. And Marlin, I remember when Marlin found me, she said, look, come and have a look at this. And I said, well, that's a bit similar. And she said, they're very, very similar. And not only that, but they've got this and this and this. And non-metric traits are, please explain it properly so I don't get this wrong, Charlotte. What are non-metric traits?
Classed as normal variants in the skeleton, so you get things like, they're not pathological, not caused by disease, but for example, you get extra little bones in the skull, parts of the skull joint, worms. And people have looked at the distribution of these in skeletons, in cemeteries, and found family groups that all have the same thing. Well, I think they're family groups, but without DNA, you won't be able to prove it.
But that would be a great marker to, you can't go and DNA the whole planet. It would be phenomenally expensive. So what you do, you target something that becomes more interesting. We'd all like to, yeah. Well, yes, exactly. But what you do is you target something that looks like an anomaly, where you would actually think, this looks like an issue. Let's see if it's true or false. And with DNA, you can start to do that now. So it's fantastic.
Has there been any mobility sponsored oxygen isotope done on this to separate out those that have come from?
Yes, and I cannot for the life of me remember what the results were. But they were mostly British, I think. I think there were potentially some Europeans, but please don't quote me on that because I can't remember. But yes, somebody started to do some work. There's a lot of forensic applications to a lot of this as well, as you can imagine. So there's been some really good forensic research done on, for example, Zooms, which is the identification of animal bones or human bones. And one of our students came and she said, do you know anywhere whether there's a mix of animal bones and human bones? I went, yes, there's a corner of this field over here. Walk this way. And so what we did is well, rather she did, I just left her to it, and she walked up and down this field. I can't believe the number of times she walked up and down this field. And I said, you will find human remains and you will find animal remains. Now, she was an osteologist, so she could identify them, but there were fragments. And she said, this is what I'm after, because the small fragments, forensically speaking, if you're looking for human remains and you find a small fragment of bone, you don't know if it's definitely human or definitely animal. Anyway, so they applied the Zooms to them, and she did her master's dissertation on this, and she produced some fantastic results. And yes, there were distinct human remains, distinct animal remains, and all the human remains were in the corner of this field, exactly where they're supposed to be. So it does work. So there are other applications with millions. Sorry, Charlotte.
This may be a long answer for you, but thinking about battlefield archaeology, particularly excavating human remains and the ethical considerations of doing that sort of work, were any comments on that?
Personally, well, live out me, I've got to be careful. Right. I believe one of the best ways I will put this back on ourselves. If you go to the barber and chop your hair off, you don't keep it. If you go to the dentist and take your tooth out, you don't keep it. If you've got a bad kidney and you get a replacement, you don't keep your kidney. If you get your leg amputated, you don't keep the leg. We are very disrespectful of our own human remains at every level. And yet we are expected to be more respectful of our human remains as soon as we die, which seems a bit inverted. Surely we should be more respectful of the people, not the human remains. So I'm a believer that as long as you do not disrespect them and you show the utmost respect for these people, I believe that archaeologists show the most respect for human remains of any people I've ever come across as a group of people. So in that, if that answers the question, then yes, I think we, under certain conditions and in the right manner, we should be doing this if it answers questions that will hopefully help everybody. It should not be used, for example, like the Nazis did, to focus onto something for an ideology that can be misused, and therefore, no. There are lots of misuse of archaeology and history that I'm completely against. But in the right hands, and I'm an archaeologist, not an osteologist, so I will back away from this slightly anyway. But yes, we treat these human remains with the utmost respect. And we do continually until we rebury them or we do something else with them. So hopefully that answers the question.
And should they all be reburied?
Uh,
That's a big question.
when they are this unique and we continue to get information from them, as long as they're respectfully treated, then you could argue that they can always be reburied at a later date, but we are still finding information from them. So that is an open-ended question. I don't think anybody will ever answer that successfully.
I think if I may close there, because we could have a seminar on this subject, a day's seminar. How are you fixed?
Yes, definitely.
Any more quick questions?
Just follow on from that.
Can we answer this one first? Because she was first, I think, but otherwise, well, I will get both in quickly. Then.
I just want to ask, following on from sort of reburying, what about display of human remains in museums? How does that fall in with ethics and respect?
You could now suggest that in theory you could scan the whole skeleton, make a plastic version and put that in the cupboard or the display. It's like any archaeological, historical, anthropological remains. It's where you draw the line, and there is no answer. I don't think, because it's the way it's all those remains are treated and how you deal with the people that you're discussing. Sorry, go on, we've got one.
We're moving a bit peripherally from the main subject, and I think we should rein ourselves in a little bit. Can I?
Again, it was just following on from what you said. Did you leave things where they were, or have you exhumed them and put them elsewhere? You can't go digging just making the things every time.
Most of these remains are going to get disturbed one way or other. In terms of the dining room, she was going to have the whole floor dug up because the whole dining room smelt badly of something. We found out there were rats under the floor and everything. So she was going to clear it all up. The mass grave was being disturbed by the excavation of the building. So I think.
So those two graves are still there with 3 in one and 1 in the
No, that's now removed because obviously she didn't particularly want to know that there are burials under her dining room table. Do we rebury them? We hopefully would do one day, but at the moment we're still, like I say, we'd like to answer this question about the DNA. Are these people related? It's how you're treating them, and also how much you want to, make an issue of it.
I think, Tim, you've stimulated enough conversation.
Probably too much.
No, not at all. And you've stimulated us all to go home and sit and not watch the telly, but to think about burials and men with their heads chopped off.
Thank you very much.
So I'll draw this to a close, and we'll go and have some coffee, and then we'll come back. It's 5:00. What do you say, Jessica?
In 10 minutes? That'd be okay with everyone?
Yeah. Yes, between quarter past and 20 past.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much
Thank you very
indeed.
much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Keith, and thank you for inviting me to give a talk about leprosy. I was thinking, how could I link my talk to Tim's? And I would say that some of what I'm going to talk about is a bit about violence, because people with leprosy today suffer from structural violence, i.e. they live in communities and environments that are not conducive to having leprosy. They're often stigmatized. So that's my link. Tenuous, I know. So this is what I wanted to really talk about today. A little bit of background about why I ended up studying leprosy, its importance in bioarchaeology, and the importance of bioarchaeology, and look at evidence for the disease, past and present, challenge some myths about leprosy, and then some final thoughts. Why leprosy? Well, Keith already said that he hopes that his inspiration came to me on leprosy, and it did, because I started working for him in 1983 at Bradford University as a research assistant, looking at the history of leprosy as seen in skeletons. I think that it's a very interesting disease socially today, and it is in the past, and it's still around, and people think it's gone away, but it is still around with certain communities around the world. And in bioarchaeology, the study of human remains, we're learning new things about leprosy that we didn't know before, and we're understanding it better, and I'm hoping that our understanding of the past is helping people understand it more today. Particularly, I would mention, and I'll talk more about this later, we're looking at its origin and evolution, particularly using ancient DNA analysis. So Keith was the inspiration. He introduced me to leprosy back in 1983, and I'm very grateful for that, Keith.
My pleasure.
I wasn't sure how many people had come across the discipline of bioarchaeology, but I just wanted to put this slide up to tell you why I think the study of human remains from archaeological sites is really important, because if archaeology is the study of people, the closest we get to those people are through their remains that are buried. And my favourite part of bioarchaeology is paleopathology, the study of disease in human remains. And we all know today that if you have poor health, that affects your normal function in society. We've seen the ramifications of COVID, haven't we, over the last 18 months to 2 years, and how that's affected how society works. And I think studying disease in skeletons gives us a deep time perspective of who we are today, how we've got here, and why we are what we are. And I'm hoping that in the future, increasingly, paleopathology will help people understand better health today and maybe planning for the future. And paleopathology nicely complements evolutionary medicine, which is a discipline that's quite nascent, it's quite new, and a lot of medics are now trying to get evolutionary medicine into the medical curriculum, with some success so far. And it's looking at, again, the deep time perspective. It's called Darwinian medicine of sickness today. So let's turn now to leprosy and what it is, what it's caused by, how it's contracted and transmitted. It's caused by two mycobacteria, Mycobacterium leprae, first discovered in 1873, and more recently another organism, Mycobacterium lepromatosis, which was only discovered in 2008, so it's a recent finding. A lot of the work, the early work on the bacteria, Mycobacterium leprae, was done by Hansen, and in some parts of the world, leprosy is called Hansen's disease. It is transmitted from human to human via someone with leprosy coughing, sneezing the bacteria out of their respiratory tract, and another person inhaling those bacteria. It's very much associated with poverty and limited access to education, and healthcare. It primarily affects the skin, nerves, and for bioarchaeologists, the bones, so we can recognize it in the skeleton. You can see there some of the early signs of leprosy, skin lesions on that little girl's cheek, and also what people often describe as clawing of the hands and also of the feet due to involvement of the nerves that causes contraction of the fingers and the toes. Again, talking about COVID, you can't get away from it, can we? But people with leprosy are at much greater risk of contracting COVID, and COVID and the environments in which it flourishes have led to problems with access to healthcare for people with leprosy. So structural barriers, talked about structural violence for people with leprosy, but also structural barriers to healthcare during COVID. I think it's interesting to reflect on some of the historical sources that talk about the spread of leprosy from human to human, and this is from the 14th century in Italy, and they were already thinking that leprosy was in the air, and that it could be drawn into the bodies of people. But also, I think is interesting too to reflect too on the fact that they thought that people with leprosy should be separated from the rest of the population and forced to live in isolation. And there's quite a lot of historical evidence for that happening. I should mention that there are a couple of animals that can contract leprosy and harbour it in their bodies. And the first is the 9-banded armadillo that flourishes in the southern United States, particularly these days. And it's a natural host for Mycobacterium leprae, the bacteria. Also of interest, if you're interested in armadillos, is that they have a strain of the Mycobacterium that is the same as what we found in Europe in the past through ancient DNA analysis in skeletons. The other animal is the red squirrel. And in recent times, in fact, in 2014, they discovered in parts of the UK, I won't go into the detail of that map you can see, they found red squirrels with leprosy. And in fact, if you can see the pictures next to the map of the red squirrels, you can see that the ears of the top one are damaged and behind the ears of the bottom one. And lesions very similar to human lesions related to leprosy. So the major publication was in Science in 2016 about red squirrel leprosy. They've searched for leprosy in red squirrels in Europe and not found any yet. Anyway, a bit more of that later. But this disease, like tuberculosis, because tuberculosis can affect other animals, it's very, very much relevant to the One Health perspective in medicine, which were really developed from about 2005. So we're looking at the links between human and animal health, but also the environment in which those diseases flourish. It's all joined up thinking. So what does leprosy do to the body? Well, first of all, it rarely affects young people. It affects men more than women, although I wonder whether those statistics are actually real, because certainly in developing parts of the world, it's often the women who don't get access to healthcare and get diagnosed. So maybe that affects the stats in terms of male-female frequencies of leprosy. And it also affects young and middle-aged adults. You can see there the signs and the symptoms of the disease. Some skin lesions here. It affects the nasal structures, and the nasal structures collapse, and you get this dish-shaped appearance to the person affected. It affects the upper jawbone, particularly, and you get loss of teeth. And that's a result of inhaling the bacteria through the nose and the mouth. And then we can get the involvement of the nerves, and that can lead to lack of sensation, particularly in the hands and feet. So a person can walk over stony ground and not feel it, and then develop ulcers. And that can then track into affecting the bones of the hands and the feet, and cause considerable damage, as you can see here, loss of a lot of the parts of the finger bones. Symptoms, people often have a hoarse voice because it affects the larynx, and all the senses are affected, as you can see here. And the respiratory system is also involved, and people can get nerve pain because of the involvement of the nerves. And then we get other parts of the body as affected, you can see on the bottom right, including the bones and the teeth, which is perfect for a paleopathologist. Today, if you look at World Health Organization figures, the frequency of leprosy has come down massively since 2001, and that's really mainly due to drug therapy, so several antibiotics in combination, and also improvement in living conditions in some parts of the world. There are, however, about 200,000 new cases per year around the world. And here you can see a map showing you numbers per 100,000 of a population. The darker areas are the areas where we've got people most affected. But the treatment is free, and it has been for a long time, as you can see. But unfortunately, a lot of people in those parts of the world just don't get access to the healthcare facilities that provide those treatments. But without early detection and treatment, this is what can happen. You've already seen this image, but people may end up with amputations particularly of their legs or feet, and we get impairment, disability, and then stigma, and then ostracism, and all the socioeconomic and psychological consequences that leads to. There's been some interesting work done on the origin of leprosy using DNA analysis, and Mono et al. Published a couple of papers. The first one based on DNA of the bacteria in samples from living people around the world, and the second one was modern but also ancient samples of DNA of the bacteria. And essentially what the first paper told us is that leprosy probably originated in the East Africa or the Near East, probably 100,000 years ago, and then spread east and west via migration, particularly along the Silk Road to the east, through the slave trade to the west, but also through colonialism. And what you can see here is this is DNA sequence variation. And essentially the bacteria, there are 4 types of the bacteria based on the DNA. And you can see the colors replicated in the world. So these are where the different variations in the DNA are found, different types. And you'll notice that this one here in Europe is type 3, more of that later. And that seemed to eventually be transported probably through the slave trade and colonialism across the Atlantic. So this is great data, but we have to test it using paleopathological evidence of leprosy and the DNA from skeletons. And at the moment, we can't actually say for sure that this is the scenario that happened with the origin and evolution of leprosy, because we don't have enough DNA data from skeletons. But we've got some interesting results, which I'll talk to you about later. But basically, the modern bacterial DNA, these are the places where the different types are found. So essentially, if you've got that information and you get a type 1 bacterial strain from a skeleton, you start to wonder, well, if this skeleton was buried somewhere in the UK in the medieval period, well, was this person coming from these parts of the world? More of that later. Okay, so studies of leprosy in archaeology and history, primarily based on skeletons from archaeological sites. Sometimes we have excavations of leprosaria, leprosy hospitals, an example there of Winchester. The other really good example is the Chichester Leprosarium, where the skeletons were excavated and are now curated at Bradford University. And then there's a lot of work by historians, oh dear, by historians looking at all the historical evidence associated with leprosy. And I would recommend, if you're interested in this book by Carol Rawcliffe in 2006, and this book too by Luc Demaitre. So it's skeletons from archaeological sites. And in fact, I should say at this point that most skeletons come from archaeological sites that are not linked to leprosy hospitals. Majority, I did a survey of the evidence for skeletons with leprosy globally, and the majority buried normally for their time period and place. I should also mention that there have been conferences on leprosy, and I'm going back to Bradford again. In 1999, I think it was, Keith, we held a conference on leprosy.
I remember it well.
Yeah, and it's published 2002. And there is Keith, looking very dapper. And it was great because we had clinicians there, we had historians there, we had people experienced in ancient DNA analysis, but also experienced in just looking at skeletons for evidence of leprosy. So I mentioned earlier that there are quite a lot of myths associated with leprosy, and these are a few of them. That it's described in the Bible. Well, it is a myth. Unfortunately, it's not really. Well, there may be people described in the Bible with leprosy, but it seems that there's been a mistranslation of a Hebrew word, which actually means skin disease, impurity, uncleanliness, and sin. As I said, it might include people with leprosy, but probably included a lot of people with different skin diseases. The myth that it's incurable, it's not. If you get the treatment early enough, you don't end up with the impairments and disabilities that I've described. That fingers and toes drop off, they don't. You may get damage to your fingers and toes, and they shorten, but the skin contracts around what's left of the bones, and you still retain fingernails and toenails. But it's not a problem today. As you've already seen, it is. And those 200,000 cases per year, you can forget easily that there are a lot of people living with cured leprosy. They've been treated, but they still have disabilities that they're living with and all that goes with them. So the World Health Organization gives you these great figures that it's going down, 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 but there are a lot of people out there who are still experiencing leprosy and the ramifications of that. And then the final one, everybody in the past was stigmatized and sent to a leprosy hospital or to an island or wherever. And that's clearly not the case, as I'm going to show later. I actually did a questionnaire of about 300 people, asking them questions about leprosy. And it was interesting that the results overall showed that Western society, i.e. the UK, really there's not much of a difference in knowledge about leprosy in Western society compared to non-Western society. And there's been lots of surveys done on knowledge of leprosy around the world, and that's essentially what I found. The final question on that questionnaire was, what does the word leper conjure up in people's minds? And what I found was that they were all negative terms. And you've heard people in the news talk about lepers. In fact, during COVID, I remember listening to a woman in Leicester saying, "I feel like the Leicester leper because I've got COVID." So people ban this word around and don't really think about the implications for people with leprosy today. So we don't call people lepers, we can call people are affected by leprosy, but they're not lepers. If there's one message you take away from here today, please don't use that word. But there have been recent debates in fact last year in a couple of papers that were published about what word should be used for people with leprosy. Some people advocate using the word, the term Hansen's disease, because of Hansen, who found the bacteria back in the 19th century. But then people say, well, he did terrible experiments with the bacteria on humans in Norway. And so really, it's not a good thing to use his name. But the latest is mycobacterial neurodermatosis. That's been recommended by Dinah Lockwood and Ruth Butlin, who you know work with leprosy. I guess it covers skin and it covers nerves. But anyway, I'll leave that one with you. But you can see people write books on lepers and Confessions of a Teenage. I mean, it's just, well, it just worries me that people are still using this word. And if you go up the road to Ripon, there is a chapel, and on the signpost it says Leper Chapel. I need to talk to Ripon, I think. Anyway, whether a person contracts leprosy and whether a skeleton is affected by leprosy depends on immune system strength. So if we look at the immune spectrum of leprosy, we get lepromatous leprosy on this end and tuberculoid leprosy on the other end. These are the people with lepromatous leprosy that we will actually identify from archaeological sites, because they are the ones that get the damage to their skeletons. So they've got low resistance to the bacteria. And these people at the other end have got high resistance to the bacteria, and therefore they don't necessarily develop any bone damage as a result of the bacteria in their body. And they're usually not recognised by paleopathologists, although some recent work has suggested how we might identify them. The problem with looking at skeletons for evidence of disease is that only a low percentage of people with disease will get bone damage in their skeletons, and leprosy is one of them. 3 to 5% of them untreated people in the past, will get damage to their skeleton. So we're missing quite a lot of people by just looking at the skeleton. But we can use ancient DNA analysis to pick up leprosy in people in the past who may not be showing any bony changes. There is a tendency in paleopathology to forget, when we're looking at leprosy, that this guy was really important in developing criteria for recognizing leprosy in the skeleton, Muller Christensen. I was very fortunate, back when we first met Keith in 1983, we went to Copenhagen. In fact, Anne came as well, and we visited Wilhelm Muller Christensen, and I'm here with him in 1983. It was a real privilege, because he showed us around his leprosy museum, which I don't think exists anymore, where the skeletons he excavated from a site called Nusved in Denmark were curated. So he developed the criteria that lots of people use today, that Keith developed from. And here we can see the face, the hands, and the feet are the most affected parts of the skeleton. And here you can see some examples of that. I mentioned inhalation of the bacteria. We get damage, particularly to the upper jawbone, and loss of teeth. The nasal cavity widens, and you get loss of you can feel at the front of your nose, you've got a little hard spine, which is that, and that disappears to that. So you get that dish-shaped appearance when you look at someone's side on. The palate can also be damaged. You get damage of the bone of the palate and a connection between the nose and the mouth. And often, well, not often, but sometimes the roots of the front teeth and the upper jaw don't develop normally. And so that makes them, they fall out easier as well. And then the nerves are affected. You can see here some nerves involved in a person with leprosy. They've enlarged, talked about ulcerations of the feet, but also of the hands, and then the underlying bones can be affected. This is an example of someone's foot, a medieval individual from Denmark. This is a normal foot. You can see how damaged this area of the foot is. Same goes for the hands. This is a radiograph which shows that most of the fingers or parts of the fingers have gone from that side and are definitely going on that side. Keith worked with Jos Anderson, Jos Anderson worked with people with leprosy, particularly in Ethiopia, and developed the diagnostic criteria for leprosy in the feet, but also in the hands. This contraction of the fingers can cause, as you can see here, can cause damage to parts of the finger bones that can be identified in skeletons. So those are the bone changes. What's the evidence for leprosy around the world? Well, we see skeletons with leprosy from 3 continents, but they're particularly common in Europe and particularly in the medieval period. So I'm talking about the 12th century through to the 16th century. A lot of evidence in these countries. And the earliest evidence is coming from Hungary, India, Iran, and Turkey. The trouble is that the data you have about people with leprosy in the past very much depends on what cemeteries have been excavated. So that picture could totally change next year if more are found. Here you can see a map. This is Europe omitted, showing you these early skeletons, 2000 BC in India, and possibly in Nubia, 2300 BC. The Iranian evidence is yet to be confirmed because it's not been published yet. And I keep saying, you must publish this. It's really important in the history of leprosy, but it hasn't happened. And then we've got lots of evidence in Europe, as you can see. Here's the early evidence, 3700 BC in Hungary, and some early evidence in Turkey. This evidence in Scotland, and this is a map of the UK showing evidence of leprosy, different periods of time. There's possible prehistoric evidence in Scotland, but DNA analysis has not confirmed that. But I still think the bone changes of the skeleton are convincing. If you look at historical information, you can immediately see that we've got older evidence in skeletons than we have in historical evidence. So, for example, 600 BC in India, we've got evidence 2000 BC in India in a skeleton. The trouble with historical evidence is there's a real challenge with interpretations. Are they really describing leprosy as we know it today, or is it something else? And are skin lesions that you see in images definitely leprosy or not? And this is a really good paper to read about really interpretation of medical evidence from historical sources, published in a while ago now, but saying that, you know, if you've got no or minimal evidence that the description mimics the medical view of the time, then you really can't take it as read that what you're looking at is what you think you're looking at. And I just put that on me. This is a London Bill of Mortality for a week in the 17th century, and you'll probably recognise some causes of death very easily, and then others that really makes you wonder, what does suddenly mean? Is it a heart attack or a stroke? What is purples or rifting of the lights? But maybe consumption is tuberculosis. But it very much depended on the people making those records as to their experience of actually diagnosing what a person died of. So I would say the hard evidence in the skeletons is what you need to prove that there's leprosy in the past. A little bit about diagnosis and treatment. How was it diagnosed in the past? Well, looking at the person, you know, are these skin lesions leprosy or not? This is leprosy. There are apparently about 2,000 skin diseases today, and you wonder how diagnosticians in the past could actually separate out the different diseases from each other and diagnose the right ones. Looking at blood and looking at urine were also methods of diagnosis. And there were rather unconventional things like looking at a person's face through a charcoal flame. And if it looked nodular, then yes, the person had leprosy. They probably didn't need to use the charcoal flame, they could just see the person. And treatment, herbal remedies in the medieval period, particularly things like scabious. And you wonder whether they're confusing scabies with leprosy. Scabies, the skin disease. In the 19th century, Shalmugra seeds were made into oil and injected into people with leprosy. Not very effective. Applying hot irons to points of the body, not very comfortable. Bloodletting in the medieval period was quite common for leprosy, using leeches or just cutting at different parts of the body, or using cupping. You've probably seen this maybe in some parts of the world where you heat up a glass vessel and apply it to a part of the body, which creates a vacuum, and that's supposed to help with certain treatments. Wound treatments, this is someone with ulcers of the leg with leprosy. So wound treatment and also bathing. So the usual view of the treatment of a person with leprosy tends to be this. People are shunned. See, these people are climbing up these steps to get away from this person. And in historical records, people were meant to use certain clothing and carry a bell to warn people of their approach. But I think archaeology is changing that view quite dramatically. We know from historical records that people were segregated with leprosy, but they weren't, not all people were necessarily segregated. It depends on whether you were diagnosed or not. So there were probably people with different diseases in these leprosy hospitals, not just leprosy. In more recent times, sort of thinking 19th century now, islands were used for, well, these two islands were particularly used for people with leprosy, Robben Island in South Africa and Spinalonga in Crete. Anybody been to Spinalonga? Worth a visit. And in Molokai, Hawaii, a peninsula was used for 19th century people with leprosy. But the question is, was this practice for everyone in the past? And my data suggests probably not. The other thing to say is that Carol Rawcliffe's book suggests that leprosy hospitals are actually quite nice places to be. At least you get fed and watered, and you got shelter, and it was probably better than being out on the streets without those comforts. So the skeletal record, there's evidence for skeletons buried with leprosy. I'm just going to take a few examples here, but just to say that I'll repeat, the majority of skeletons with leprosy around the world in the past were buried in the normal way for their society. But some burials were quite special compared to the rest of the cemetery, and there were very few burials that were marginalized, being on the margins of the cemetery, sort of maybe ostracized a bit. An example, there are actually 4 leprosy hospitals, or even more leprosy hospitals from the medieval period in York, but there are also parish cemeteries with skeletons with leprosy. You can see the damage to the nose there, buried in the normal parish community cemeteries. This is Brompton-on-Swale in North Yorkshire, and there's someone with leprosy buried there in that parish cemetery. And this is an interesting one from Edicts Hill in Cambridgeshire. And this person with leprosy was given a bed burial, which was reserved for high status people. And so you do wonder how people were being treated in the past. They're not all shunned, not considered worth bothering about. And this is a cemetery in Hungary, medieval cemetery in Hungary, and the person with leprosy is buried in the mix with everyone else. But of course, we've got the leprosy hospital cemeteries where we have a high proportion of individuals with leprosy in their skeletons. And that an example I've already mentioned is the one at Chichester. So I think ideas about how people were treated in the past with leprosy are really changing quite considerably now. I just want to briefly look at ancient DNA analysis and its contribution to understanding leprosy. The first ancient DNA analysis of the leprosy bacteria was done in 1994. Quite a controversial study, but anyway, nevertheless, it was the first study. And it's been used down the line to confirm about bone diagnosis, to look at leprosy in people with no bone changes, to also look at the evolution of strains of the bacteria, which are specific to geographic regions, as you've already found out, and also to look at genes that are linked to susceptibility and resistance in leprosy. And I just wanted to, I'm not going to describe this in detail, but just to highlight the sort of evidence we're getting out of skeletons now on leprosy. There's data from different countries, different skeletons that have been subject to ancient DNA analysis. And I'll just highlight this one. This is a medieval Swedish skeleton. It's given us the genetic variation 2F. Also has been found in ancient Denmark, England and Italy. But today it's the strain that you would expect to see in East Asia, in the Near East and Asia. So one, asks the question, well, did that person travel a long distance eventually back in the past and eventually ended up in Sweden? We don't know, but it's an interesting thought. And the variation 3 is quite common in Europe in the past, and it's very common in the United States today. So again, you think about people's movement and transporting of the bacteria and the associated strain to other parts of the world. The thing that's developed recently is the use of stable isotope analysis on skeletons with leprosy to look at the mobility histories of these people to see if they have moved from their birthplace where they were born and raised, and whether they've been buried somewhere else quite distant from that birthplace. I'm not going into details of how that works, but that's the idea. These are all studies of skeletons with leprosy. And this particular one, Sweden, found that both people with leprosy and people without leprosy in a particular community cemetery were all locally born and raised and buried in their local community, buried with their local community. And they also had a similar diet. So people weren't being distinguished because they had leprosy or didn't have leprosy as to what diet they were eating. The same goes for this study, a more recent study of skeletons from 2 leprosaria in Denmark, where the male and female skeletons also had the same diet. And this is a more recent study of one of my ex-PhD students looking at another community cemetery in Norwich from the 10th to 11th century, and finding again that all the adolescent skeletons that she studied with leprosy were all locally born and raised and had not come from very far away. So it just challenges notions of social exclusion in the past when you look at this scientific evidence. I should add too, a recent paper in BMC Biology, of which I'm a co-author, have been looking at the strains of the bacteria, the leprosy bacteria, in different sites around Europe, and found actually that the leprosaria have lots of people with different strains of the bacteria in or buried there, which suggests that people are coming from different regions and then being buried in that leprosy hospital cemetery. And I should also add, this is another way where we've linked, or not we, people have linked stable isotope analysis, looking at mobility, with the DNA evidence to really paint a picture of or a story of this person's life. This skeleton was from the Winchester Leprosy Hospital Cemetery, and it's a young adult man. And you can see here there's a scallop shell, which is an indication that he was a pilgrim and probably went somewhere and came back and was buried in Winchester. And if you look at the DNA analysis, he had the 2F strain, same as that one from Sweden, that skeleton from Sweden. This is where that is today, in Central Asia and the Middle East. But also another thing that you might be interested about is that there's also a 3I strain in a skeleton from the same site. And that 3I strain has been found in red squirrels on Brownsea Island, which is a little island off the south coast of England. And you wonder about the link between the red squirrels and the medieval period, medieval people buried in Winchester. So to finish, what do we know about leprosy? Well, we know a lot, but we want to know a lot more. As you can see, it's had a long history of origin, and from origin to an evolution. It's still with us today, and we should be concerned about it, particularly about all those people who are living with the disabilities that leprosy has caused. And we're starting to understand its origin and evolution, but there's a lot more to know about it. What we don't know is whether there is more to be found, and it's likely when more excavations are done, we will find more evidence of leprosy in skeletons. So there's lots of parts of the world where we haven't got any evidence in skeletons. And that may be just because paleopathology as a discipline is not quite as advanced as in the Western world, and people are not looking for the evidence or don't know what they should be looking for. And what it would be interesting to know, and I think, going on from the DNA and the stable isotope analysis, the real impact of mobility of people in the past. We know that people were moving around a lot. But I think there's been an assumption that people didn't move around a lot. But now we've got this chemical analysis, this stable isotope analysis. We know that people were moving around the globe. And I think linking the DNA analysis with the stable isotope analysis will really tell us a lot more about the network of connections that people had across the world in terms of the diseases that they were taking with them. I'd also like somebody to find the recently discovered bacterium that causes leprosy, Mycobacterium lepromatosis, in skeletons or even mummies from archaeological sites. I mean, it would be great if that could be found. So the future, well, there'll be more of the same, but I think there is this concentration on DNA analysis, but I think there's still a lot of work yet to be done on refining the diagnostic criteria for leprosy in skeletons that people are tending to ignore because the DNA analysis gets the big money, the big grants, and the media attention and the high, journal papers like Nature. So that's what people go for. But I think there's still quite a lot of basic work that needs to do on diagnosis. But I think we'll also continue to work across disciplines. So we've got chemists that work on human remains, stable isotope analysis. We've got geneticists working. We've got paleopathologists working. We've got historians working on the disease. So working across the disciplines is much more productive than not doing that. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you think that the dead can teach the living a bit about disease. And if you have any questions, please ask them. That is my book. and it has everything I know about leprosy in it, and probably Keith knows about leprosy in it.
It's a first-class book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you
And
so
I-
much.
Sure, that was a very complete and concise exposition of leprosy in the medieval period, and
That's my final say on leprosy.
all go on really. We'll take some questions.
Yeah, I'll try.
Yeah,
Martin. What's the evidence of the youngest skeleton with leprosy? How young? I was thinking, how does it first of all, do you want to reproduce with somebody who's got leprosy, and then is it passed on to the child, and is there any evidence of it?
It can be.
Something that is,
Yes, because if you are close to your mother or father and you've got exhalation of droplets containing the bacteria, potentially yes, it can spread. It is a hard infection to contract, though. You have to be in contact with people for considerable amounts of time, close contact, to get it from someone else. There are very few young skeletons found with evidence of leprosy. I think the youngest I know is about 6 years of age. In fact, it's a Roman skeleton from Gloucester.
and does it show the same pathology?
Yeah.
Right.
What about the oldest skeleton where the leprosy DNA can be extracted?
Oldest skeleton.
with regard to that, if I might just interject, Professor Muller Christensen says that, no, it wasn't, it was William Joplin that told me that the bacterium of leprosy is of high infectivity, but low pathogenicity. In other words, there are an awful lot of people around working in leprosy places who have got the bacteria within their body, but it is not producing the disease because of their immune status. Would you agree with that, Martin?
Yes.
Good. We are.
The oldest skeleton DNA work. Oh gosh. Actually, it's the Hungarian. It's the 7000 BC. Yeah.
Yeah, you said in the studies it showed that they had people with leprosy had a similar diet. Wouldn't you have expected I'm just running on the crosscut of that analysis, because you would expect from what you said earlier about leprosy, people with leprosy being treated actually better than their environment. Their diet might actually be better than the average person at the time.
Well, the problem we've got is that okay, which I guess should have been picked up in the review process. You've got skeletons with and without leprosy in the skeleton, right? But some of those people without leprosy in the skeleton might actually have had leprosy and been recognised as having leprosy when they were alive. So I think it's a bit of a flaw to the study, I think.
The bone changes of leprosy are relatively late developments in the clinical manifestations of the disease. In other words, it's the soft tissues that get affected before the bones become.
You've got to have it for a long time before you get the bones affected.
How long approximately? I mean, are we talking years or decades?
Depends upon the immune status of the individual infected. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Is there any genetic evidence why some develop big words that I can't pronounce? Charlie, my head to come round.
Lepromatous versus tuberculoid.
Yeah, one versus the other.
Oh gosh.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Somebody else might be able to answer that. I don't know.
What was that?
Is there any genetic evidence for people developing tuberculoid versus lepromatous leprosy? Well, I mean, there are susceptibility and resistance genes that have been identified in living people with leprosy, but I haven't read enough literature on that to be able to answer that question.
Transplacental transmission of the bacterium doesn't occur. So you can't get, I think I'm right,
No, I mean, there's been lots of studies looking at the transmission of leprosy through breast milk, for example.
Yes, but not transplacental.
But
not
and
in
also,
utero.
So it has
they've
to be
not-
graft, basically.
but I think there's been some evidence to suggest people might contract it from their mothers in utero. More
Has it?
recent, yes.
Oh, well,
yeah.
I'm out of date.
No, I mean, they've been looking at all sorts of ways, insect bites but there's no real evidence for that.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, sorry, there's a recent paper that has found that the oral microbiome can be transferred
to the developing fetus.
I don't know the details of that, I'm not an expert in it, but it wasn't specifically to Leprosy.
No, but
But I'm just wondering whether that could be,
it's possible.
but my question was more down to the individual level at the Edicts Hill.
Yeah.
I found that really interesting that you have a high status, burial, the individual with Leprosy.
Mm.
I found this, but I know you found this at Norton Priory. This is one of the individuals that you originally identified.
Mm.
And that individual was placed in a high status position within the priory with
Yeah.
3 non-adult skeletons placed around it, and that was quite high status burial as well.
Mm.
Do you think there's enough evidence to suggest individuals of high status were differentiated between those of lower echelons of society?
I don't think we've got enough evidence. They are few and far between. Yeah. But what's he called? Baldwin the Fourth, was it?
Oh, but Jerusalem, yes, Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem.
This is just another example of a high status person.
He was said to have leprosy. There was Baldwin the First, Second, Third, and Fourth, and they were kings of Crusader Jerusalem. I don't know whether there's any evidence for it. The other one, of course, is Robert the Bruce, the King of the Scots, who hammered Edward II at Bannockburn. He was supposed to have lepromatous leprosy. But can you imagine a chap with his hands like this and he's riding on a horse and hammering down the English knights? Not at all. And the diagnosis was made because there were some literary references to Robert the Bruce having leprosy, and more particularly that there was the skull of Robert the Bruce, which was excavated. It's now in Dunfermline Cathedral under a layer of pitch, so it can't be seen again. But a cast was made of it, and Professor Muller Christensen showed me the cast. He'd got a cast over in Denmark.
I've got a cast as well.
Have you?
They get about.
But there was no evidence on that
Yeah,
that Robert
they
the
did a facial reconstruction in JMU, and
They did.
2 variants, one potentially with the process, obviously, and one without.
I missed that.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Oh, sorry.
Professor Chamberlain first.
I wonder if you can tell me any more about I've seen lepers' windows in churches where they obviously couldn't come in to take communion, and it was given that. Do you know how much interaction there was between the church and whether the lepers were allowed to go in?
Yeah, there are these, they call them leper squints, don't they? Where people with leprosy could view the service from outside through a little window. In fact, the Ripon Leper Chapel up the road has an equivalent of that. They sometimes had low windows so people could look through the windows as well. And they've got some low windows on this one at Ripon. So it was, yes, it's just to keep people out from being exposed to, well, the community in the church being exposed to person with
Can I
leprosy.
just add a little rider on that? I raised this very question with a man called Lawrence Butler, who was a church archaeologist based in Leeds, an extraordinarily bright man. And I mentioned the question of the leper squint. And he said, it's nothing to do with leprosy. He said, it's just that the community the size of the church and the community had grown to such a level that they couldn't get everybody in. So they had these holes in the church so that they could see the high altar.
It does make sense.
Does that make any sense?
It does make
Yeah,
sense.
as well, yeah.
Also, I think some work done in 2005 looking at these. They suggested actually they're more for ventilation of the church than
To cope with COVID.
well, they were planning in advance.
Medieval COVID.
So is that to make version three with windows up?
Absolutely.
I had a bit of a silly question.
It's never silly.
Mentioning about Robert Bruce. Were the leper knights real?
Yes,
Well, Keith
the
knows all
leper
about
knight.
that.
I doubt it. Those the Templars and the Hospitallers are both Crusader people.
I was wondering what information you knew regarding like the day-to-day life of someone living in a leprosy hospital, potentially like medieval times.
Sorry, have we got the answer to this? Keith, have you finished your answer?
Oh, yes.
Sorry, I didn't know what you had. Yeah. Actually, there's very little historical data telling you what the day-to-day life of a person with leprosy in the hospital was. Got little bits of information about what they might have been eating, little bits about how many people were attending to them. But no, it's sparse evidence, although any evidence there is incorporated in Carol Rawcliffe's 2006 book. And no, I don't get royalties from that.
As an archaeologist and dealing with previous sites where there have been infections, do you have to take any precautions? How long is the bacterium passable, for example?
Right. Well, I'm probably not up to date on this, but I think that we don't really have to worry about it archaeologically, unless you've got an archaeological context that maybe you've got lead coffins that are, well sealed. I mean, I know the Christchurch Spitalfields 18th, 19th century crypt excavation. Certainly the excavators ended up with high levels of lead in their blood, didn't they? But and they were worried about some of the bodies that were in the coffins that had skin lesions, maybe smallpox. So I think when you've got a more recent context like that, you've got potential problems. But I think that environmental health has got to be contacted in those instances. I mean, you may know, Tim, I don't know.
What's exactly?
Well, if you've got potential body with lesions.
I think there's a full spectrum, because obviously there are just skeletons, and then, for example, St. Beesman.
Yeah, St. Beesman.
Cumbria. When they opened the lead coffin for that, he still had the fluid blood in his body.
Yeah.
So the chances are that in examples like that, you can imagine anything is possible. But obviously, normally I presume there's not the soft tissue or anything.
No, I mean, I don't know.
Not encysted bacteria, are they?
I don't think the bacteria can live pathological bacteria can live in the soil for very long. No.
And I don't know about the blood in St. Beesman, for example. Has it got a lifespan before it, at a certain temperature or whatever?
I was thinking of sort of cholera sites.
Cholera sites.
The previous mass graves, and then buildings come in now. And
Exactly.
What's
the protocol? Now, there's a cemetery that has skeletons that you curate from Sunderland. No? A post-medieval site? Is it Sunderland or is it?
I don't know.
I'm sure there was historical evidence for that site with cholera, but I guess archaeologists have to just call in the relevant experts, public health, environmental health, just to make sure. But I'm no expert.
I was involved in a site in Cambridgeshire where we were told there was a Second World War level of anthrax in a chemical station, and they were going to build a housing estate on it.
Oh, great!
We had a whole health and safety issue about if we were contaminated with anthrax. And they told us what to look for. And I said, if I see that, I'm not hanging around to put my protective suit on, which they gave us.
How it got years ago.
So there obviously there's this level of health and safety which doesn't make much sense when you just want to run.
Yeah, I know.
No, years ago, I was asked to examine some skeletons that were being excavated from the nave of Tong Church near Bradford, in a textile area. And I went to look in these, and I lifted the lid of a box, and the dust came out. And I put the lid back, and I said, "Bury the lot." They weren't very interesting anyway. I think one more question.
If transmission is dependent on immune status,
Yeah.
is it worthy of vaccination?
Vaccination. Okay, so the BCG tuberculosis vaccination can be effective in preventing people getting leprosy in certain parts of the world. Been lots of trials, and I'm not sure what the latest on that is, but some parts of the world it's very effective preventing people getting leprosy.
Burma and Brazil, I think, were the two places that started off that.
Mm.
And one it seemed to prevent leprosy, and two, it didn't seem to prevent it. One more quick question.
Can you catch it from squirrels?
Well, that's the question. Big question. Don't get too close to an armadillo or a red squirrel. But certainly there's evidence to indicate that people are contracting it from armadillos because they hunt. They keep them as pets, hunt them, keep them as pets, and then they eat them as well.
In brown sea, that's one of the reasons for going to brown sea is to see the squirrels.
Oh, well, look out for leprosy.
I worked on browsing. I'll be a bit worried.
I think time is coming on. I may ask Martin to give a vote of thanks. I'll give you mine, Charlotte. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.